Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. Sort of a breezy little read. You can finish this in an afternoon. In this video, I'm going to be talking about my interesting history with this book. At least I think it's interesting, but I'm biased because it's mine. My reading experience in terms of difficulty, what I took away from the novel, whether I would recommend it, and some reading advice. And then later on, some potentially spoilery stuff that have to do with my interpretation of some of the events of the book, Hamlet references, and sporadic miscellaneous thoughts, and gushing. So this is a notorious work of postmodern maximalist fiction by a very sad and very smart and talented guy. This book was published in 1996 by Little Brown, and it takes place in a near future where the calendar years have been subsidized to different corporations like Burger King. So instead of, say, 2025, there's the year of the Whopper. There are sort of three major stories in this book. The first one takes place at a tennis academy, and you get into each character's rankings. Some of them are addicted to drugs. Some of them have become indifferent towards success in their sport. Some of them are really striving for success in that sport. The second story takes place just down the hill of that tennis academy, and it's at an addict's halfway house. And primarily we follow this character, Don Gately, who is one of the residents and one of the workers at the halfway house. He's been sober for, I think it's 18 months, and he has to deal with all these addicts and simultaneously is fighting his own addiction to the substance that brought him to rock bottom in the first place. The third section, and sort of the backdrop for the entire book, is about this tape called Infinite Jest, a tape that's said to be so entertaining that when you watch it, you become catatonic and you don't want to do anything else but just keep watching the tape over and over and over again. The US, Canada, and Mexico have become one giant nation called Onan, but basically America is calling all the shots. America has put all of our waste into parts of New England, and it sort of drifts and wafts into Quebec. Quebec is obviously not happy with this, and so there are these terrorist insurgent cells that are trying to disseminate from Onan, the big nation. So everyone is seeking the master copy of this entertaining tape. The Quebec terrorists, they want to disseminate it across America and essentially leave the country powerless to its own pleasures. Meanwhile, the US is trying to get a hold of the master copy, so Quebec can't get to it. And before we get into any more of the content of this book, I just want to talk about my personal experience with reading it. I am 27 now, but when I started this book, I was in high school. My high school copy looks like this. It usually has a front cover on it, as most books do, and that front cover got just ripped apart from throwing it in my backpack. How far did I get in this? So I read it in high school. When I went into college, I kind of dropped it, and I would pick it up every now and then. I got to page 315, my first go-around. Now, this is a 1,079-page book, if you count the endnotes, and I do because they are essential to reading this book. Yeah, there are like 300 endnotes, and they're all essential. Well, most of them are essential. Some of them are just funny, and some of them are like citing sources or descriptions of medicine. It was a book that for years had just loomed over me as this really great book that one day I'll finish. And the other day, I finally finished it. I would often say to people that it's the best book that I have never read because, I'd never finished it, but you gotta be kidding me. I had never finished it, but everything that I'd read up to that point was so great. I just absolutely loved it. It was challenging. It was beautiful. It was hilarious. It was so inventive and so original. And in fact, once I finished it, I went to the first couple chapters and just read the first couple chapters over again. Part of that is because the ending is a little bit open-ended, and there's some stuff that you find in the beginning of the book that answers a bit of those questions that you have by the end. I've read some other books by David Foster Wallace. I read Consider the Lobster, which is a book of essays that I really love. Same with The Broom of the System, which was his first novel. I read that last year, and it placed pretty high on my favorite books of the year list. And it's a book that I think about a lot. It was so funny. It kind of pales in comparison to Infinite Jest, but I think most books probably do. On top of that, throughout the years, I've just consumed every possible interview that I could find of the guy. He just had a lot of great things to say and very prescient things about our culture, about the way that we consume entertainment, about advertising. He was very observative of the time that he was living in, but I feel like the stuff that he was talking about has only become more apparent in our modern world. And keep in mind, this is pre-social media. This is pre-smartphone. Yeah, I think what a lot of people come away with this book thinking is this guy was pretty ahead of his time. Rather than starting from where I had made it in high school and a little bit after high school, I decided to start the book over from the beginning, and I'm so glad I did that because there are a million different narratives going on. This book never stops introducing people and concepts to you, even towards the end of it, which I think is really great and justifies its length. You know, I don't feel like it overstays its welcome by any means. I want to talk a little bit about what you can expect stylistically from reading this book. What's the actual experience of reading something like Infinite Jest like? Did that sentence make sense? I don't know. The first thing that you'll probably notice when reading this book is how funny it is. David Foster Wallace inserts humor into even some of the most complicated or mundane sections of the book, which make those sections feel more manageable. Genuinely, he's one of the funniest authors I've ever encountered. I want to shout out some of my favorite funny moments from the book. One of the characters said, "The man was so cross-eyed he could stand in the middle of the week and see both Sundays." One kid says about another kid, this kid Trolsch, he says, "Trolsch is so dumb he thinks a manila folder is a Filipino contortionist." There's a company that I think is supposed to be like a Toshiba type computer brand, and it's called You Shit You, which is just, I mean, that's just great. One of my favorite sections of the entire book involves this fake tennis game that he invented called Eschaton, and the way that scene develops, it had me smiling from ear to ear because it was so funny. I can't remember the last time I have enjoyed, like, had pure joy reading a chapter of a novel like that. So what I really like about his style is that he's first and foremost a personable communicator. He wants you to understand and empathize with these characters, adopting the brain voice of whatever character is the focal point of whatever section. And in fact, communication seems to be one of the key themes in Infinite Jest. There are characters who appear to be mute. There are characters that misunderstand English turns of phrase because they're from Quebec and, you know, their first language is French. It seems like the inability to communicate is a very terrifying prospect for David Foster Wallace. There are also sections about addiction, depression, suicide, ambition, all just so empathetically rendered. This is not some turgid postmodern fireworks display with no substance and no heart. This is a book that is trying to speak in a dialogue with its audience, who has consideration for its audience, and it's trying to get at the core of what it is we're trying to avoid. What is it in us that we feel needs narcotizing? How did we as Americans get to the point of feeling that every waking moment is about abiding, that there's some sort of emptiness in us, there's some kind of discontent within us? How did we get here? And what does it do to us when we can, as much as we want, choose pleasure over pain? You've got to be kidding me. What does it do to us when we can always choose pleasure and minimize pain? I mean, it seems logical to want to decrease pain at all times, but there's something we lose in ourselves, something that's hard to define. There's some detachment from whatever it is we consider to be our being, and we become dependent on whatever it is that is pacifying us, and that makes us susceptible to being taken advantage of or to being controlled.
Some of the sadness that it seems to me kind of infuses the culture right now has to do with this loss of a sense of purpose or organizing principles, something you're willing to give yourself away to, basically, and that the addictive impulse, which is very much kind of in the cultural air right now, is interesting and powerful only because it's a kind of obvious distortion of kind of a religious impulse or an impulse to be part of something bigger. It seems to me that one of the scary things about sort of the nihilism of contemporary culture is that we're really setting ourselves up for fascism, because as we empty more and more kind of values, motivating principles, spiritual principles almost out of the culture, we're creating a hunger that eventually is going to drive us to the sort of state where we may accept fascism, just because, you know, the nice thing about fascists is they'll tell you what to think, they'll tell you what to do, they'll tell you what's important, and And we as a culture aren't doing that for ourselves yet.
There's another theme in the book about believing in cliches. Many of the characters in the halfway house who are new to AA kind of scoff at the trite aphorisms that AA uses, such as like one day at a time, or they reject the idea of giving yourself over to a higher power to, relieve themselves of the substance. I mean, and it's understandable. All of this stuff sounds completely banal, but what they find is that the more that they lean onto these kind of trite phrases, and the more they try to eschew their hypercriticism, the more they actually appear to be true and sort of like a life raft, and it becomes less of a thing that you believe in intellectually and more of a thing that you just have to act on because it works, no matter how dumb it seems, which in itself is a cliche. But believing in these cliches is to get outside of your head, to turn the cynical consciousness into genuine action. One of the characters talks about how the act of choosing is to love, how it's not about passion or emotion, it's about conscious effort in spite of everything. There's a thing kind of later on in the book about being horizontal, and one of the characters starts to feel like it's more preferable to be horizontal than to be vertical. And of course it seems nice to have everything done to you and for you, to not have to choose, to just accept whatever fate may come. Because choice can be a burden, not knowing which choices are right and wrong, but having to choose anyway, sometimes making lifelong decisions in pursuit of something that you don't know is going to pay off. There are choices that you could theoretically make every day that could end in disaster. But the life of just laying down, of being horizontal, not only is it a passive life, but horizontal is the orientation of the dead. And I think what Wallace is saying is that we cease to live when we relinquish our ability to choose. I think the main argument of the book, if there is a main argument of the book, the only escape from the prison of our pleasures is the conscious choice to abide, to not retreat, and to face seemingly unendurable hardships and not look away. Now, people all the time are talking about how prescient this book is, how many things that it predicted, and it's really amazing what he was able to predict. Now, he didn't predict streaming services necessarily. He was still living in the age of the VCR. He has what are called cartridges, which you can basically like order, and then the government also has spontaneous dissemination cartridges that they play. But it's essentially what Netflix was originally. You'd get movies delivered to your house and whatnot. But he also talks about when you have that unlimited choice to just watch whatever you wanted, a lot of people kind of craved the cable television that told you what to watch, which is insane insight. I mean, he talks about analysis paralysis before it became kind of a hot button topic. Now we talk about it in terms of like TikTok or Netflix or having all these streaming services. I hear people all the time saying, I'd rather just go back to cable. He literally predicts FaceTime and people using filters to make themselves look better because they hate how they look. He talks about sort of the hip, ironic advertising and trying to appeal to young markets by not being stuffy and corporate. I am going to kill this machine. And he even talks about the degradation of our attention spans and our inability to be alone with ourselves and our own thoughts. We have to just constantly pump entertainment into our ears at every given moment of every day. I mean, I'm certainly guilty of that. Now, another thing when talking about Infinite Jest is the difficulty. Is this a difficult book? How difficult is the book? Can a normal person read this? And as a person who is pretty normal, I would say you definitely can read it. I won't say that it's easy. I wouldn't say it's the most difficult book I've ever read. I think the Faulkners that I have read are way more challenging. I would say Omen Setter's Luck by William H. Gass is certainly more difficult than this book. But I think there's a difference between complexity and difficulty, and I want to talk about that a little bit. When I think of a difficult book, I think of a book that takes serious work to get through because I don't understand what's happening. But I think in this book, you don't need to understand every single reference to understand the narrative. I think the literary references and the mathematical digressions are only deeper colors that you can dive into if you want, and I think you'll get a lot out of those things. There are a lot of 10-cent words in this book that I had to look up, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. Obviously, his vocabulary is better than mine. Why not learn some new words when you're reading a book? I mean, we're engaging in a sort of niche or art form these days anyway. Why not pick up some knowledge along the way? I don't know. But I don't feel like there was a section of the book where I felt alienated from the conversation because of my ignorance of any given topic. And I don't get the sense that David Foster Wallace is laughing at the reader or trying to spite them. I think he wants you to stick around, and he wants to communicate with you, and he'll often follow up most of his most complex sections with sections that are really straightforward as a kind of like treat, or kind of to keep you following along and reassuring you that you can do this. Now, I'm going to say something a little controversial, probably, but if you'll allow me to get on a soapbox for a second here, I really, really strongly discourage you from listening to an audiobook as a first reading of this book. Of course, if you have to, go for it. But because of some of the primary themes about this book being about the benefits of laboring over something and about the deficiencies of comfort, you're not only robbing yourself of the pleasures of overcoming something through dedication, but you're also missing the firsthand experience of that theme that the book is trying to deliver to you. In other words, the novel isn't just trying to deliver a message to you, like direct it at you, but it's forcing you to contend with that message in real time because of its scale and because of its complexity. Anyway, that's all that I really wanted to say about the book. If you want to know my thoughts about it, spoiler free, that's what I think. I think that you should read this book. I think you should at least read the first chapter, see how you like the writing style, and go from there. I'm not going to tell you that it's going to be the easiest thing that you'll ever read, but it's very enjoyable. If I can read it, I'm pretty sure you can read it. I was going to say I'm not smart, but I think that's probably fairly obvious at this point. I swear, dude, this machine is going off yet again. Why did I film this outside? Why did I think that would be a good idea? So this final section of the video, I just want to talk about some things that might be considered spoilers, some takeaways that I had. I want to say that I didn't really consult any outside resources or other people's interpretations of things that happen in this book, at least not willingly. Sometimes I was looking up a phrase from the book to check if it was a reference, and then, someone would give their interpretation of the event, which I wasn't really asking for. Oh, and then I should also say that I watched Hamlet, production of Hamlet, immediately after finishing this book, just to pick up on some references that I missed. Of course, I've read Hamlet before, and I love Hamlet, but there were some things that I picked up on when revisiting Hamlet, when keeping Infinite Jest in mind. So this section's kind of going to be the miscellaneous thoughts that I had throughout the book, some interpretations of events, and some allusions to Hamlet that exist inside the book, and sort of my interpretation of those things and how they relate to the themes of Infinite Jest. Was that too long and convoluted of a sentence? I don't know, probably. But this is Infinite Jest we're talking about. You're used to it at this point. There's a line in Hamlet where Hamlet says, "Oh God, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space." And how that relates to Infinite Jest is the boundaries of tennis. I'm pretty sure it gets into this in the book, that tennis is this finite space, but there are these infinite possibilities within that space. So I thought that parallel was pretty interesting. It probably has even deeper meanings than that, but that's the parallel that I made, at least. These infinite choices within a finite space. There's, of course, a scene in a graveyard where Hal is holding up his dead father's head and saying it's too late. A pretty obvious reference to the grave scene in Hamlet, where Hamlet stumbles upon the dead body of his court jester Yorick. And yeah, the dad of the main character in this book is essentially Yorick. He's also kind of Hamlet's dad, but he's mostly Yorick. And he says that his primary goal is to entertain, which, if there's nothing more on the nose about him being a jester. I have some notes here about this that I'll just read off of my notes app. Reference to a suicide being se offendendo, which is then said to either be a speech flub or a reference to the graveyard scene in Hamlet. Se defendendo is a legal term meaning in self-defense, so se offendendo would mean in self-offense. The idea of killing oneself in self-offense. One of the things that I did know about this book that's kind of like an Easter egg, the first two words of Hamlet are "who's there," and the first two words of Infinite Jest are "I am." There are so many links between Hamlet and Hal. The dad, who was also a filmmaker, made this film series called The Cage. And I think what the dad is trying to do is bring his son out of his own head, the cage of his own mind. That's the purpose of the entertainments that he's making, are to communicate with his son, to get him out of his own head, to be instead of be. Because what Hal thinks is being is living inside of his own consciousness, and what the dad, James, believes is being is to do. So to be is to do as opposed to be is to be, which sounds really heady or like, but basically he's like trying to make it so his son, it doesn't fall into the same traps of solipsism as he did. I also thought maybe, so there's a thing about James and Cadenza, the father, microwaving his own head, like Sylvia Plath put her head in an oven. And I was wondering if that was not only a suicide attempt, but also maybe an attempt to destroy the tape that's lodged in his own brain. I don't know if I'm reading too much into that or if that has any grounds whatsoever, but it was just something that I thought of. Maybe he's trying to break free of that cage himself by literally destroying the cage. Hal's grandfather says to Hal's father, he says something like, mind is just body. But Hal sees himself as existing as mind, possibly meaning he only sees value in himself when he can express to others what's in his mind. And the consequences of that value system is striving for outside validation as a means of deriving a self. Also, what's interesting is the person perspective changes the more that Hal becomes inbent and inside of his own head. Most of the book in the scenes with Hal are in the third person, but as he becomes sober and therefore has to contend with his own thoughts, they become in the first person until he is unable to speak directly to people, which I thought was so cool. Such a good way to put that idea into kind of like practical narrative device. Oh, in that scene where the dad is lamenting about how he was trying to delight the infant that he knows Hal still possesses somewhere inside of him was really interesting because there are so many themes about the inner infant inside of us. After all, a bulk of the story takes place in the year of the dependent adult undergarment. Adults wearing diapers. There's a lot of suicidal ideation in the book, which can be tied to be or not to be, the most famous speech in Hamlet, but also probably the most famous speech about suicidal ideation in all of literature. Like I mentioned, Hal's dad kind of also represents Hamlet's dad, especially because he appears as a ghost. Oh, there's also a 1984 reference in the book, which I don't even want to get into. There's so much in this book. I mean, it's a really complicated, I don't even want to talk about a Sierpinski gasket, okay? We don't have time. I don't even know what to think about all that. I think I've talked about this book to the limits of my voice. If you made it this far, thank you so much. If you made it this far and, watched the spoiler section and are still thinking about if you should read the book, I think you should definitely read the book. I'm excited to read more of this author. But anyway, that's enough time spent on this video. Oh, another benefit of reading this book is you could bicep curl this and you definitely get a good pump in.